All right, this is Ricky,
And this is Brendan.
and you're listening to A Gentleman's Disagreement.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though we did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.
Good afternoon, Ricky. On the afternoon of Friday, April 25th. Ricky, our last episode we looked at an Oscar-nominated movie from last month, this past year in March of 2025, and that Oscar-nominated movie was The Apprentice, and we were super lucky that we had two of the producers, Benjamin Kramer and Gustavo Nascimento, who took us behind the scenes of the making of an Oscar-nominated film. One other Oscar-nominated film this past March was Conclave, Ricky, which I haven't personally seen, but I think I might be firing up this weekend because we are due for a conclave in the next couple of weeks, due to the passing, which in some ways was expected as the passing of Pope Francis, which in some way was expected as he had been sick for a long time, but also was unexpected is that he was out on Easter, this past Easter Sunday, and while he didn't read his sermon, he wrote it and had one of the other cardinals read it, and he met with Vice President Vance for a few minutes on Easter Sunday, and so the news that he had passed on Easter Monday was shocking and I think saddening to a lot of people around the world. But also, when you live a life such as that, 88 years, did so much good around the world. It's very much like a celebration of his life, and at the same time, just the nature of the Catholic Church, the influence of it. There's so much intrigue around what's going to happen next, and we figured we it's something that we wanted to talk about, and that we wanted. It's a little bit like you got to talk about it now because this is when it's all happening.
Yeah, definitely. And though we haven't seen the movie, I hear you found someone who can talk to us a little bit about the real thing.
Yeah, actually, I'm super excited. I reached out to Father Oliver Rafferty, who is, I'll give him his full bio when he comes on, but he's a professor of history at Boston College and is also a Jesuit priest, where Pope Francis was the first of a lot of things to, probably most famously the first South American pope, but he was also the first Jesuit elected to the papacy. And I think Father Rafferty, not only being a student of history, but a Jesuit priest himself, I think was going to provide like a really interesting perspective for us to learn more about this. I think for you and I, I'm born and raised as a Catholic here, and you're not. But I think for both of us, we're coming at this as always from different perspectives and different experiences, but always wanting to learn more. And I don't, in terms of shining more of a light on Pope Francis's life and legacy and politics, and Father Rafferty in many ways seems like the perfect guy to be able to educate us on all of that. So excited to talk to him today.
Yeah, and he's a historian to boot, so I'm also very much looking forward to this conversation.
All right, so I guess there's no need to waste any more time. Let's bring him on.
Let's do it.
All right, we are now extremely excited to welcome Oliver Rafferty onto the program. Father Rafferty is a Jesuit priest and a professor of history at Boston College. He has previously been an examiner at the master's and doctoral levels for Oxford University, the University of London, Trinity College Dublin, NUI Galway, University College Dublin, the National Council for Academic Awards Dublin, and the University of Western Australia. So he is well traveled. He has written or edited 7 books and two different many articles, but two different articles. Father Rafferty caught my attention as The Politics of Pope Francis, which you wrote in 2020, and The Politics of Pope Francis II, which you wrote in 2021. So
Yes.
really excited not only for your general background, but for the specific background you've had looking at the life and legacy of Pope Francis. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, pleasure.
So the first question is a very general one about what is Pope Francis's legacy to you. For me, as a Catholic, the first things that I think of are his kind of title of like the people's pope, and how close he was to the poor, even the the places where he chose to live in just a two-bedroom place in the Vatican, as opposed to the palatial traditional papal
Yeah,
residence, and
apartments. Yes. Yeah.
yeah, right. So that Go ahead, but for you,
Yes, and no, because don't forget that he continued to use the traditional offices in the Apostolic Palace. He may have lived in the Casa Santa Marta, but he continued to use the offices that all the popes had used. So it's a question of emphasis, it's a question of style, rather than a fundamental and radical kind of change. After all, he didn't do his own cooking as he did when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires. It's true, yes, he gave a different feel, shall we say, to the papacy. Um, on the other hand, one has to say also, in slight criticism, that some of the things he did, when thought were for purposes of show, rather than decisively held positions. For example, on one of his first trips overseas, his briefcase was carried onto the plane. And what did he do? He sent somebody onto the plane to retrieve the briefcase so he could be photographed carrying up his own briefcase onto the plane. So one thinks to himself, well, what is that about? On the other hand, I mean, clearly he did have a different approach. Also, the whole business of, and the media has been filled with this for the since he died on Easter Monday, that he was the Pope of the poor. Now, in fact, when a journalist once put that to him, he said, "No, I'm not the Pope of the poor. I'm the Pope for everyone. I do like ideologies." So, in other words, he wasn't willing to be pigeonholed in the way that too easily, I think, commentators have tried to do this. And I think he was right to say, after all, if you are the Pope, you know, you're the Pope of the whole Catholic Church, and that's what he wanted to emphasize. Without doubt, of course, consideration of the marginalized, people on the periphery, the poor, they were central to how he thought, let us say, about the church. But at the same time, he was alive to the complexities of Catholicism. And one very touching aspect of his general approach to things was that there's a small Catholic community in Gaza, and they were held up in the Church of the Holy Family there. And virtually every day during the war, he rang them. And this gave immense encouragement to that community, especially given, that the Pope has, 1,001 other things to do, but he nevertheless made this a priority. And I think that those sorts of things will be remembered chiefly as his legacy, I think. In addition, of course, I mean, he articulated a number of very important views about Catholicism in, for example, Laudato Si, his encyclical on the environment and so on. But one of the things, even in that, he deals with the question of inequality, the question of poverty, and he says that the poor don't want to have handouts. What they want is dignity. And therefore, it is incumbent upon the developed world to create circumstances in which people do have jobs, people do have work, because it is work and the engagement in the economy which gives people their dignity. And I think that's a very, very important point to make. And partly, of course, that is building on traditional Catholic social teaching. So one has to see him kind of in continuity with Catholic thinking, beginning with Pope Leo III, Pope Leo the 13th, in the 1890s.
I think that's something that's very interesting to me as a non-Catholic, hearing how or how you're viewing how the media is trying to specifically portray him. One of the other things that I hear a lot about is that he did come out and say a lot of things, but didn't do as much in terms of enshrining it in doctrine. I'm curious how you view that sort of sentiment that to me as an outsider of sorts feels is pervasive in terms of evaluating his legacy.
Yes. Well, I mean, in one sense, it's not for popes to amend doctrine. After all, this is how we work in Catholicism. We have a received body of teaching, which is built up over centuries, ultimately believing that somehow it originates with Christ. And the Pope is the defender of that. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and so on and so forth. And his job is to as we read, and indeed this was the gospel at his removal to St. Peter's a couple of days ago. Um, strengthen your brethren. This is what Jesus says to Peter at the Last Supper, that Satan has got his way with you, but when you recover, strengthen your brethren. And that is the role of the Pope in the Church, to strengthen people in their faith. Popes don't make new doctrines. They confirm what the Catholic faith is. And it's true that he gave a different feel to certain aspects of how Catholics go about things. I mean, he was more disposed to think that it might be possible for people who are divorced and remarried to receive Holy Communion. He was against the politicization of the abortion issue. Politicians who find themselves in circumstances where, for whatever reason, they have to go along with abortion, so far as the law of the land is concerned. He didn't think that those people should be excluded from communion. The big example being that of President Biden. And he told Biden on one occasion, "Yes, you are a good Catholic," which rather shocked some people, I have to say. So what one has with Francis is, as one would expect, a pope who is concerned about the reality of people. And see, he wanted to eschew ideology, very much against this. He wants to deal with the pastoral realities in the church as he found them, and wanted to encourage people. So one couldn't expect, frankly, that he's going to change doctrine. First of all, because that's not what popes do, and he cannot do that. All he can do is to try to kind of clarify things. He can try to make the acceptance of doctrinal reality to some extent easier for people to digest. He has to take on board the reality of the world as it is, whilst at the same time preaching the Catholic faith. And that's why he does not and didn't advocate for, as people thought he was doing, homosexual marriage, or divorce or abortion. None of these things. So in other words, he didn't change doctrine. He didn't move away from doctrine, but he blunted, shall we say, the edges, um, um, to make Catholicism slightly more acceptable to people who might otherwise simply reject it and repudiate it.
Right. You took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say he very much, at least the image of the church, he softened the edges at a particularly difficult time when he came aboard it in 2013. And I think even though he's maybe not quite as quote unquote progressive as a lot of the media would have made him out to be, or even would have liked him to be, he did stand in fairly stark contrast to Pope Benedict, who had come before him. And I think maybe that gave him even the veneer of being even more progressive than he was.
Well, I think that is true only at one level, because if you look at Benedict's social teaching and Francis's social teaching, they're almost identical in the repudiation of the harder face of capitalism, and the whole business of trying to evolve a different way of looking at the world in terms of, in fact, economics. So there is a kind of intellectually, shall we say, a continuity. Where the discontinuity comes in, it's on these kind of hard button issues that are so prevalent in American culture wars, shall we say. But that is not of the essence, I don't think, of Francis's teaching or of Benedict's. I mean, I think that there is a good deal of continuity in what the two popes were trying to do when they looked at the world from social and economic perspectives. And as I say, both in continuity with this kind of longer narrative of Catholic social teaching and advocating for a fairer world, frankly. Um, hmm.
Well, along like the economic front, for whatever reason, again, maybe this is just my perspective, it felt like Francis was more in conflict with some of the leaders of the capitalist world than his predecessors might have been. Did you feel?
Well, you see, the thing is, if you read the response to some of the writings of John Paul II, um, when he in fact, lambasts capitalism, and don't forget that John Paul II spent a lot of his life under communist Poland. And this kind of influenced his thinking to some extent on the economy and on globalization and so on. But one finds in the pages of the New York Times excoriations of John Paul II because of his criticism of how capitalism actually works in our world. So at that level, I don't think that there is a kind of a great divergence in views over the last three popes, if you look at them and their teaching. And the same with people like Paul VI, Populorum Progressio, for example, The Progress of Peoples, a famous social encyclical of the 1960s. And again, this was received with less than enthusiasm, shall we say, in the capitalist West. One thing that one does have to say is that in 2005, when John Paul II died, President George W. Bush went to Rome for the funeral, and as did his father, as indeed did Bill Clinton. And this made a very deep impression on the Vatican. But one of the things that George Bush did then was to summon all of the American cardinals in Rome to a meeting with him. And he told them, I don't want a pope from South America. Why? Because he thought that any pope from South America would be antithetical to American international or multinational companies, that a South American pope would not analyze the world from the perspective of the North American as a capitalist system, and that he would be unsympathetic to capitalism in general. And of course, he didn't get a pope from South America. They got Benedict. But then, of course, his nightmare came true when Pope Benedict abdicated. And there, lo and behold, one had Bergoglio from Argentina. And all of the nightmares, all of the chickens, as it were, came home to roost so far as George W. Bush was concerned. I think, but that says more about Bush, I think, than a reasoned understanding of how Catholicism actually works and how popes actually work. On the other hand, it's probably true, I think, that Francis was too edgy, shall we say, in his condemnations of capitalism. I mean, in the sense that if you're the Pope and you want to try to create a fairer world where all of humanity has, to some extent, equal access to the same pie, well, you have to try to bring along the people whom you're trying to convince about the need for equity in the world. And I'm not sure that he entirely appreciated that. But not only that, but he also had, I think, and I know this is very much a minority view, that he also had kind of naive political outlooks in some areas of the world. For example, if you take his China policy, he 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 said nothing directly about the fate of the Uyghurs in China. These followers of Islam, about 1 million of whom have been, put under arrest, sent to re-education camps, all of those sorts of things, and that is the reality. And yet he didn't want to try to grapple with that particular reality. Why? Because he had another particular agenda with regard to China, driven to some extent, it has to be said, by Cardinal Parolin, the Secretary of State, who had for years been interested in China and opening up to China and so on. And it looks as if, at least to me anyway, that France went along with Parolin's thinking in a way that was not, which I don't think, frankly, is helpful. So we have a situation whereby the government of Communist China has a veto over the appointment of Catholic bishops in that country. And it seems to me that ultimately the Vatican policy, as indeed led by Francis, is to try to establish diplomatic relations between the Holy See and Beijing. If that happens, they will have to repudiate Taiwan. The Holy See is one of the few international political entities which has, in fact, diplomatic relations with Taiwan, because if you want to have an ambassador in Beijing, you have to cut your ties with Taiwan. And the Holy See hasn't done that as yet. But if it establishes diplomacy as diplomatic relations with Beijing, it will have to do that. And it seems to me that this will be utterly contrary to what Francis says or has said, the need to have solidarity with the weak and the peripheral. And so why throw your lot in with an enormously tyrannical regime and sacrifice the poor Taiwanese for your policies? But there it seems to me that there is a certain naivety also on the part of the Holy See, which thinks that somehow China is ripe for Christianization. That if we establish good relations with the authorities in Beijing, it will be favorable to the growth of the Catholic Church in mainland China. Quite frankly, I'm not sure that that is true. And certainly a person who fundamentally disagrees with this is Cardinal Zen, the former Bishop of Hong Kong, very elderly now, in his early 90s. And in fact, so disgruntled was he with Vatican policy with regard to China. He once said he doesn't know what planet uh, Vatican officials are from when they come to analyze the situation in the relationship between Catholicism and China. And there's one famous occasion when he even went to Rome from Hong Kong, seeking for an audience with Francis to explain his views, i.e., Zen's views on China, and the Pope wouldn't see him. You know? Which is kind of, again, contrary to all that Francis wanted to give the impression that he's open to all sorts of opinions. He wants to listen. We have to be a listening church. Well, he's not listening to the likes of Zen. He's not listening to Catholics in China who don't agree with the role that the Communist Party has in the Catholic Church. You might say, of course, well, the church has to deal with the realities of the situation as they are, and this is why they want to listen to the communist authorities. If Catholicism is to survive in China, there has to be some cooperation with government. But on the other hand, this is one of the lessons, is it not, from the French Revolution, when the French tried to kind of refashion Catholicism along kind of revolutionary principles, the constitutional church, and so on and so forth. What a disaster that was. And these are the things that Catholicism has to try to learn from. I don't have much faith, frankly, in the Holy See's China policy. And I think this is one of the weaknesses, frankly, of Francis when he looked at the world and when he looked at China in particular. You can also point to other instances where I think that his political philosophy, for want of a better term, sort of let him down. If you look at, for example, his initial responses to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, he virtually blamed that on the Ukrainians themselves, on the or a combination of Ukrainian ideas with those of the West and with NATO, and the whole business of how Ukraine wants to be associated with the EU, how it wants to be associated with NATO. Francis virtually said that's the reason that Putin has invaded the Ukraine. Well, it seems to me that this is a distortion completely of what was happening, and a distortion of um, Putin's view of Europe and of the rule of Russia. But one aspect of all of that, of course, was the need for, so far as Francis is concerned, to keep on good relations with the Russian Orthodox Church. Um, Obviously, the idea of, if there is ever to be Christian unity, the Russian Orthodox Church, one of the biggest of the Orthodox churches, or the biggest, and so the need to keep on good terms with orthodoxy, and of course, uh, Kirill, the Patriarch of Moscow, is in Putin's pocket, frankly. So I think to some extent, Francis's views on what was happening in Ukraine were dictated by that consideration. Mind you, he did change his mind somewhat, but not entirely, somewhat as time went on. But it took him a long time to evolve a more balanced approach. And certainly the views he had initially seem to be indistinguishable from the views that Trump has at present, frankly. And I'm not sure that that's not necessarily a very good place to be, so far as the Catholic Church is concerned.
So obviously, religion and politics have always been intertwined in some form or another. I mean, just the anecdote that you shared about George W. having, uh,
Mhm. Mhm.
hosted the
Yes.
American Cardinals to sort of sway them on who they should vote for in conclave. I think is interesting and something that I had never heard sort of about
Mhm.
something as direct as that. I
Mhm.
wonder how you sort of think about that and how the Pope's politics are the important for the position of the Pope, but also
Mhm.
for Catholicism in general. Because
Yes.
I sort of seem to think that, as people question the Pope's wisdom on his political stances, are they
Mhm.
also then questioning how he is sort of guiding the church.
Mhm. Well, I think there are two things to be said. Um, since the Second World War, Catholic thinking had been dominated by the need to confront the communist regimes of Eastern and Central Europe. And so much of the effort of Catholicism went into that. And we used to even pray for the conversion of Russia and so on and so forth as part of this. But given that for the most part, communism has collapsed, that is no longer kind of, except of course in China, it's no longer the block that it was to the propagation of Catholicism. And so the geopolitics of the world has changed enormously. But part of the issue with Francis is that to understand his political mentality, to understand his outlook, one has to look very much at the circumstances of Argentina, in which he grew up as a young man, and dominated as it was by Peronism on the one hand and the military junta on the other. So Peronism, and if you look at some of the things that he says, um, some of the positions that he articulated, they were straight out of Peronism. For example, he said that the emphasized the need for bishops to have the smell of the sheep. Well, this is pure Peronism because for Peron, the leader must be of the people. He must emerge from the people. He must keep the people's expectations, the people's raison d'etre very much to the fore of what he wants to do. He must be of the people and by the people. Well, this is very much how Francis wanted to see the role of bishops and indeed of the Pope in the church. And this phrase that was used earlier by Brendan, the people's Pope. See, that is Peronism, frankly. And he was very much, although I have to say that from the 1950s, he made it clear that he never voted in any Argentinian elections because he wanted to give the impression that he was above politics. But the whole Peronist ideology very much shaped his views. He was very much associated with, at the Jesuit University in Buenos Aires, this is when he was a Jesuit priest before becoming archbishop, very much associated with a study group on Peronism. And they used to say of him that he wasn't a Peronist priest, but he was a priest who happened to be a Peronist. So that is the kind of that's what he grew up with, and it's out of that, and then later out of the military juntas that he formed his political views. And added to that, of course, was the whole issue by the 1960s of liberation theology in Argentina and South America. But on the other hand, when he became pope, he became rather reluctant to talk about that because he said he tended to think that liberation theology was simply very much of its time. It was a South American phenomenon, a Latin American phenomenon. I don't think he was entirely true in that, by the way, because in fact its origins are really in Europe. But he said it was very much conditioned by the circumstances of Latin America, and there's a certain sense in which the church has moved beyond that. So that his political outlook, yes, Peronist, but also, as we've talked about earlier already, distrustful of capitalism, distrustful of how ideologies work in the world. So he wanted to get to a point where we are not driven by ideology. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, when somebody put to him, "You're the Pope of the poor," he said, "No, that's an ideology." And he wanted to get beyond. In other words, and this is one of his strengths, of course, one has to say, that he wants to deal with situations, he wants to deal with people as they are. And that's how we have to think of people as individuals and of their needs. And we have to think of them in terms of the church's pastoral approach to people and not in great ideological blocks, which will only divide people. And this is how people get on their high horses because they're attached to an ideology that they don't want to surrender. And
But this brought him in for a lot of criticism from more conservative Catholics, right? Of saying that,
mm,
his approach of kind of seeing the world, quote unquote, as it is, or addressing people, quote unquote, as they are. And conservative Catholics might argue that this is antithetical, that we have the truth, the way, the truth, the life, and that's it. It's been unchanging for 2000 to 25 years. And why are we, again, I think your point that it's more complex than it was portrayed, but I think the
Yes.
portrayal of was he was in some ways betraying that kind of Catholic truth in favor of trying to welcome more people into Catholicism.
Yes, but on the other hand, as you've said that, and this is how you opened, he did not attempt to in any way change Catholic doctrine. And part of the thing is that if you look at the history of the church, beyond doubt, Catholicism evolves. The church of the first century was not the church of the 13th century by any stretch of the imagination. And so we can all have a very romanticized view of what the church should be or what the church was. Um, and I think what Francis did was to give a different feel to Catholicism. Um, I think in some of the positions that he took with regard to specific practices in Catholicism, he was simply wrong, it seems to me. I mean, the whole business of restricting people or forbidding people to go to the old Tridentine Mass, the old Latin Mass. I mean, I think this is wrong. Why, in an age when fewer and fewer people are going to Mass, why say, no, you can't go to Mass if it's going to be in the Tridentine Rite? It just doesn't make sense to me. And it goes against his other um, strain of thinking, the idea of encouraging people to be Catholics who they are. So I just didn't understand this kind of dichotomy, so to speak. He, despite the fact he says that he eschewed ideology, it was getting into the mindset that, oh, if you're in favor of the Tridentine Mass, if you're in favor of the Old Latin Mass, you're against the Second Vatican Council. And this was he was dead set against, that we must embrace Vatican II. But on the other hand, you see, that was exactly the view of John Paul II. Given all his conservatism, he was nevertheless deeply committed to the Second Vatican Council, as was Ratzinger, of course. But Ratzinger allowed people to attend the Tridentine Mass. On the other hand, both popes, though this is a phrase that originates with John Paul II, Vatican II as authentically understood. So, in other words, that not every kind of liberal ideology that has sprung up in Catholicism, claiming to be an outgrowth of the Second Vatican Council, isn't necessarily that. So, in other words, that we have to understand Vatican II within particular parameters. After all, Catholicism isn't simply something that we make up. But on the other hand, there are tendencies in humanity, are there not, to refashion God in our image and likeness. We're meant to be made in God's image and likeness, but at times we want to refashion God in our image and likeness. In other words, that Catholicism should serve our needs. But for people like John Paul II, for people like Benedict, and also I think for people like uh, Bergoglio, religion, Christianity is something which is transcendent. It comes to us from without. But of course, in the incarnation, it all comes from within. But nevertheless, we do believe that God has certain will for our world and for human history. And that is what we're trying to discern. That's what we're trying to live out in authenticity to a certain tradition about Catholicism.
Yeah, so I guess somewhat along those lines, like bringing it back to the United States here, the two most, famous is the right word, but p politically powerful Catholics that we have are former President Biden and the current Vice President JD Vance. And to me,
Mhm.
they mark really the kind of the two blocks of Catholicism here in the United States. And feel free to correct me if your vision is different. But I read a Pew survey from last year, and it said over the last 5 years that the share of adult population of Christians in this country has stabilized after falling for decades. And if you're looking at why it's stabilized, it's not because younger progressive people are coming to the church. They've pretty much all left the church. What you're getting is you have like the older people, the Bidens of the world that kind of grew up in one world in one Catholic church, and then you have the Vances of the world who are young men tending to be more conservative that are converting to Catholicism. And you can see not only in like their styles, but in their worldviews, and I would potentially posit even in their views of the role of Catholicism and Christianity in the United States. President Biden and Vice President Vance view things very differently. So, curious on your kind of perspective on all that and the role that the church is playing and is poised to play in this kind of new world that we have here in the United States?
Well, okay, what you have identified is a kind of a division, shall we say, between white middle class males in America, so far as Catholicism is concerned. But don't forget that Catholicism has also been helped in America by particularly the influx of migrants. From Latin America, from other Catholic countries, they have injected a dynamism into Catholicism that has helped the church as an organization to continue to survive. So I wouldn't put all my eggs in the particular basket of conservative versus progressive Americans. That is a reality. There's no doubt about it. And I think I do agree with you that there is a certain sense in which, and indeed we've all read these Pew surveys, that people who are applying for the priesthood these days tend to be people who are more conservative in theology and possibly even more conservative in politics. On the other hand, you see, in the old days of Catholicism before the Second Vatican Council, the American pattern was to be conservative in theology, but liberal in social issues. Don't forget that the origins of the Democratic Party, or not the origins, but a large section of the history of the Democratic Party was working class Irish. And there's a certain sense in which the Democratic Party has moved beyond that. So it's not as if it's true that in general Catholics have become richer. It's true, lower middle class and so on and so forth. But there's a certain sense in which democratic politics have abandoned its base. And that's where it seems to me that's where the dysfunction comes. Not so much about the fact that more Catholics are voting for the Republican Party and so on and so forth. Look at the Democrats. Increasingly, who are they listening to? They're listening to multimillionaires, the same as the Republican Party. So that it is the Democrats who have moved on, rather than necessarily Catholic mentality. Because you still have a deep commitment on the part of Catholic ecclesiastics and people who work for the church, a deep commitment to the poor, to a more just society, to a more equitable society. The sorts of things that the last three popes have talked about and have taught. And that's still, it seems to me, very much part and parcel of how Catholicism in America works to this day. A concern for the poor, a concern for the marginalized, a concern for equity, a concern for Catholic education.
I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I guess I want to push you on this kind of new right, this new Christian
Mm.
nationalism that we're seeing that is very much imbued. I guess that's traditionally maybe more evangelical, but increasingly we're seeing it. The Catholicism is tied into that. So how does that kind of square with what you're saying with the traditional teachings of the Catholic Church and the teachings of, Francis and Benedict and so on?
Mm. I mean, I think at the level of the ecclesiastical leadership, it's very much to the fore. Um, it is true, I know, undoubtedly, Mr. Vance does not necessarily instantiate those sorts of things. But on the other hand, I'm thinking of people like Speaker Ryan of the House of Representatives. I mean, from Wisconsin, even when he was Speaker, he used to help out in the soup kitchens, in his parish
Yeah,
in
but
Wisconsin.
but Father, I'd push back. Where is he now, right? Like, I mean, he's
Yeah.
fallen he's been cast out by the new right too, right? And I feel like we've seen more religion in this in kind of administration. I'm sure you watched uh the inauguration. We have all sorts of priests coming up there, and it wouldn't necessarily be what I would describe as what I hear in church on Sundays. You know what I mean? So like, I guess I wanted to hear your opinion on this Christian nationalism that we've seen.
Mm, mm. Well, again, you see, I think this is one of the areas where I actually agree with Pope Francis, the late Pope Francis, and that is the need to get beyond ideologies. Uh, accept the ideology of love, the ideology of the gospel. This is the foundation, after all, of Catholicism, is it not? And that's what we have to try to live out. Um, but Catholicism is a broad church, after all. There will always be political differences within Catholicism. On the other hand, we have to, if one, even if you look at the history of Europe in the 20th century, how the church found it far too easy to cozy up to the regime of in fact, Mussolini in Italy, um, to to some extent to its undoing, um, and to its shame, frankly. Um, Not so much to Nazism because that was a different ball game, but yes, I think one has to avoid a situation whereby the church is identified, and particularly clergymen, priests and bishops and even Pope, are identified too much with one particular political ideology. That is not the function of the church. That is not the function of priests and bishops and the Pope, who must be at the service of all people, as Francis wanted to make clear. And that's where the emphasis should be, whilst at the same time recognizing that there are political differences among the Catholic body, but that has always been the case. I mean, look, for example, in fact, 1926, Cardinal Bio, uh, a, a, um, a member of the Roman Curia, he was a great supporter of Action Française, which is precisely the sort of equivalent, if you like, in the 1920s and before that, of what you're describing as um, Christian nationalism in the United States today. Well, Axiom Française had been condemned by Pope Pius XI. Cardinal Bio made the mistake of saying he thought the Pope was wrong in saying this. So, what did the Pope say to him? You have the option. Either you resign from the College of Cardinals or you will be dismissed. Well, he took the option of resigning, and that's what he did. Um, so, and again, Pius XI was no flaming liberal by any stretch of the imagination. And So it seems to me that that is what the role of the Pope, the role of any religious leader in the Catholic Church has to be. It is to hold people together on things that unite us, rather than um, uh, try to see the fissures or create fissures in the Catholic body along political lines, because that is not how we function as Catholics, and that is not the ultimately the purpose of the Catholic Church. It is to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that has to be front and center of all that we do as religious leaders and as believing Catholics. It is to put Christ at the center of things. And I'm sure,
No, that's really well said, well put. And I think kind of on that note, when we're looking towards the potential next pope, obviously conclave will be coming up imminently, and uh, I think you've done a really nice job in this whole conversation of kind of delving deeper than the caricatures of Benedict as, God's Rottweiler and Francis as the people's pope. And it's like, oh, well, maybe they're actually not that different. But I think one thing that I've been reading about is people were a little surprised that Bergoglio was elected back in 2013 because Benedict was seen as a more traditional, conservative pope, and they didn't necessarily think that College of Cardinals would elect Bergoglio, again, seen as a more progressive pope.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
obviously now it's the opposite, where he's appointed, I think, over two-thirds of the Cardinals that are going to elect his
Yes,
successor.
yes,
And
yes,
people are saying like, oh, it's
yeah,
probably going to be kind of somewhere along those that leads it to be more likely someone along those same
yes.
lines. So how are you seeing Conclave?
So don't forget that the conclave that elected Bergoglio, most of the cardinals in that conclave had been appointed either by John Paul II or by Benedict. And what did they do? They elected somebody who was, to some extent, trying to go beyond the particular rules for the papacy that JP2 and Benedict had evolved. So let us try to get away from this idea that somehow, oh, because um, uh, Francis has appointed 80% of the cardinals, that they're going to elect somebody who's in Francis's mold. I don't think that is true, frankly. They're going to elect the person whom they think is the best place to lead the church at this particular point. And don't forget that in the conclave of 2005, the one that elected Pope Benedict, at one point, Bergoglio and Ratzinger were neck and neck, 40 votes each, as they had. We only know this because an Italian, despite the fact that they take a vow not to reveal anything, an Italian cardinal kept a diary, and that diary was published after the cardinal's death. So we know this. The two of them were neck and neck at one point. So even 2000, even on the death of John Paul II, Bergoglio had considerable support in the College of Cardinals, and doubtless this is why he got elected after Pope Benedict, in fact, abdicated. So um, as always, you see, and we have lists of people, and I'm sure you've seen them in the last few days of speculations as to who's going to be the next pope and so on and so forth. There's an old saying about conclaves: he who goes into the conclave a pope comes out a cardinal. So we just don't know, and a lot depends on the internal dynamics. It depends on how the cardinals actually get to know one another, and this is one of the things that perhaps this conclave is in recent history uh, one of the conclaves in which the cardinals know one another the least. So a lot will depend on the daily meetings they have, the general congregations before the conclave starts, talking to one another, listening to one another, hearing each other talk and say what they believe their analysis of the needs of the church and of the world are at this stage, and that can make a very deep impression upon people. And so it seems to me that it's not, although it's a thing that we all like to do to speculate who the next book is going to be, and bookmakers like to declare who the favorite is, and people like to bet on this. I don't know if you do that in America. We certainly do it in Ireland. Um, but my only hope is that, frankly, and I hope this doesn't sound racist, I hope it is not an Italian. Um, because we've had far too many Italians in the history of God's church. And having broken the mold of a non-Italian, I would not welcome going back to having an Italian. I think even as it is, Italians have far too much influence in the Catholic Church. And let us remember, it is the Catholic Church. It is not the Italian Church. There are far too many Italian cardinals, far too much Italian influence, and I would prefer somebody who is not an Italian. No offense to Italians.
You're in a safe space here. It's okay. You're not gonna get any pushback there. But Father Rafferty, thank you so much. Really an invaluable perspective that you're able to bring to it from a life of kind of like learning about this stuff and being able to impart this and much more depth that I think that I have gotten just reading articles across. So this is exactly why we wanted to talk to you, and we appreciate so much your time and perspective.
So, Brendan and Ricky, thank you very much indeed for having me. It's been a very enjoyable conversation.
Oh, it's wonderful. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
All the very best.
You as well.
Bye-bye.
Well, that was great for me and for I think I can speak for you as well on this one that you enjoyed that conversation because I could see as he was saying things your wheels were turning. I got maybe like two comments and then I want to get your reaction, but mainly beyond the fact that we just love historians, people who like really sit with all of the things that have happened and how they lead up to the present day, but also kind of grapple with what's going on today. My sort of favorite thing listening to Father Rafferty is that he would start saying, "Well, in this direction," but on the other hand, in this direction, and he was very much, unlike some of the ways that we do try to pigeonhole
Yeah.
people and ideologies and certain things, he was very open to just like here are the facts. Here are the ways that the facts support the story, and here are the ways that they contradict it. And it's important to know both sides.
That was my biggest takeaway as well, is even for someone that has spent a fair amount of time reading about these popes in the church, we like narratives, right? We've always said that, and the easiest narratives are ones that are simple, and this is the conservative pope, and this is the liberal pope, right? And I really like that he pushed beyond that, and I think deep in my understanding a lot of the continuity between these last three popes, and I'm sure into the next pope, but even showing just like different sides of the popes. And even when I asked him that question about U.S. Catholicism, where he's able to, well, you kind of left out this aspect of a lot of these migrants that are kind of being demonized by a lot of the church, are the people sustaining the church. But I was like, oh, of course, like that makes total sense. But I also kind of left that out of my narrative, and so you can see why, as a history professor, he would be so effective.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, while we were sort of listening to some of the things that he was saying and how he was talking about Francis, one of the things you chatted me was that, you must love Pope Francis. And
Yeah, man, he blamed the Russian invasion on the Ukrainians. He was super pro-China. I was like, yeah, it sounds like your kind of guy, Ricky. Yeah.
I knew you were gonna hone in on those two. But obviously, like he went to the West Bank and visited the wall there. He uh, believed in the science behind climate change and sort of advocated for the world to do more about
Hates
it.
capitalism. Lexus is right? He was checking all your boxes, right? Yeah.
He really he really did span the gamut there. But so I think in that vein, it's very interesting to juxtapose that with what you sort of hinted at is kind of the new rights obsession with Christianity broadly, but conservative Christianity, which includes, I think, in many respects, Catholicism. So I wonder, as a Catholic, as you are, just kind of how you are sort of seeing things and how you all right, so and maybe I'll back up and sort of butcher my question, but and so you take this where you may, but obviously we are, at least in name, a secular democracy. But we have continued to see, especially, and obviously these things ebb and flow as we talk about, but in recent memory, it feels like there is a push toward to include more aspects of religion into our government. And I'm curious both on the political front, like how this works on the right, but just the broader how this works within the government. How have you been feeling about that?
Yeah, I do think that's true to some extent. I also think that as quote unquote like secular as we've always been, like this classic separation between church and state, religion and politics have always been intertwined in the United States and beyond. But I do think in terms of not only the language, which I think has been the language of politics has felt like much more imbued with Christianity in particular. I wouldn't even say religion under during like the Trump campaign and then the Trump administration so far. I alluded to the inauguration that you and I were like, wow, that was not even trying to pretend that we're not going to be like overtly kind of religious and tie these things together, particularly Christian. And it's I guess it's not only the language, but some of the ideology. I think when I had a couple questions about Vice President Vance because I think he's emblematic of a lot of what I'm seeing, and I think he's also just a fascinating guy in general. But there's a lot of young men in particular that seem dissatisfied with modernity and like kind of all of the things that are about it. And I think there's a quote from Vice President Vance back in 2021 when he was kind of speaking about his decision to convert to Christianity was like, some of the things they used to be able to say 10 years ago, like you get crucified for saying 10 now, right? And like, but is that's just kind of a general complaint that all kind of conservatives have, particularly Trump conservatives have, is like this cancel culture. So why do you turn to the Catholic Church? You turn to the Catholic Church because of this idea, which I asked Father Rafferty about, of that it's constant, that it's been the same for 2,000 years, that there's a truth here to life. And if you're a believer in Catholicism or in a different sect of Christianity or even a different religion, that's a main part of your belief of like this is the truth. That's why you believe it, right? Uh, it's hard. This is where you might say it gets, I don't know, I hate to use the word scary, or maybe I don't hate it that much, but uh, where then it starts to seep into government where there's only one way to live. And like our politicians, many of whom have been religious or very religious over the course of time, how well are you able to separate those things? Are you able to separate your life as a Catholic, as a Christian, from your job to be a government official for all of America? Are you able to separate these ideas of, I don't know, like, if I guess I don't want, we go to like this hot button kind of abortion issue, like you would argue as potentially liberal that people have the right to make their own choices. How do you square that with your Christian belief that all life is sacred and that we have to do that, right? And I think increasingly what we're seeing on the right are people bringing those directly into the politics of it. That there's less separation, there's less of a wall, and I can understand why that feels scary for people, for non-believers or people that kind of believe that they should be separate.
So, and now you're just kind of educating me on how the church sort of functions, but I understand that there's kind of like a limited amount, or really that you don't sort of question God. Are you encouraged to question the Pope? Because I think a lot of the things that Pope Francis did were, even though, right, like he didn't out and out say that it is okay and it's not a sin within the church to be homosexual or gay, but he kind of was like, but there, yes, that's a sin in the Bible, but there are other sins in the Bible, and like you can still be like a good person, a good Christian, and live your life that way, whatever. Um, those are in conflict with how a lot of the Christian right talks about Christianity. How does that work?
I agree, and that's where I probably my favorite answer of Father Rafferty's when he was kind of like, where do we ground? We need to come back to what grounds us as Catholics, as Christians, is that Jesus' example is one of love and acceptance and of bringing in is one for the poor and for the marginalized. Like all of his teachings are exactly that. That's not what I'm seeing and hearing from a lot of the kind of the new right or the Christian nationalists now. But I have always thought that like particularly something on like climate change, where there's no greater justification, especially when I was kind of like my Republicans back when I had a Republican Party, where I was like, I can't believe we managed to be the party of ostensibly the party of kind of religion and Christianity, and yet we're also the party that's like anti-climate change because what has God told us is to protect and take care of this is God has made this planet that should be the main reason why we should take care of it. Like that should I don't know why that we're not bringing the two together, like our religious strands and our care of the planet strands. But look, that's just one way of viewing religion, right? And that's probably people would say that's a much more progressive way is this idea of coming at people as they are. That's what I was trying to challenge is people, a lot of, I think, more conservative Catholics and Christians would say that if they're living in conflict with the teachings of the church, then they are not, true Catholics, true Christians, and like that shouldn't be allowed and accepted because the only true way is it's the one true way. It's not the many true ways. Yeah. And quite honestly, I guess like in full transparency, that's how I used to be. Like as the growing up as Catholic, I used to make fun of cafeteria Catholics, right? Of to say like you can't just pick and choose the beliefs that you want to be and claim that you're a Catholic. You're either all in or all out.
Oh, Brendan, inflexible? No way. I mean, all right, maybe I have sort of one more parting thought. And I think you've kind of already hinted to this and Father Rafferty really brought this in. I think one of the things that was interesting for me was that um was that was how much this movement of Latin Americans, particularly people from South America, like places like Venezuela, ended up voting for Trump. Like Trump's gain among Hispanic voters was massive. And I've always thought that this was interesting that we're very comfortable talking about voting blocks in terms of, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, other. But we don't often talk about the religious voting blocks as a way to cut across races. I'm curious what you like think about that and how much of the fact that like this the social issues, despite the fact that the economy still, quote unquote ranks on top of everyone's list, how much the social issues played into the recent election and how much of those are guided by people's religious beliefs and how they're like interpreting what their religion is telling them about society or how society should look.
Yeah, this is going to be a general statement, but I feel like all of the demographics and demographics equal destiny talk, one of the things that was overlooked on both sides, Republicans were so scared that all of these like non-white people were coming in. They were like, oh, they're going to kind of take over and they're going to be automatic Democratic votes. And I think there are probably a lot of Democrats that were also thinking the same thing. But one of the things that maybe went, like I said, underappreciated is that a lot of these non-white people are conservative Christians, and that aligns far more socially with the things that President Trump and his kind of administration will say, at least. And even if he's done a remarkable job separating his personal life and failings from the things that he says. And I think in terms of some of the positions that he's put forth, and that there are a lot of true believers in his administration that kind of believe a lot of these social conservative positions, they're far more attractive to conservative Christians. And a lot of those conservative Christians are recent immigrants. And I'm talking immigrants from all over the world, like not necessarily, obviously Hispanics are tend to be a large Catholic group, but I think there are conservative Indians, conservative Africans that come over that might not even be Christians, but are conservative in their religious beliefs, and th those beliefs align far more with the right.
Yeah, this the sort of strain of social conservative really is is broad within immigrant communities. I mean, and those tropes are like it is funny almost that it really seemingly blindsided the Democratic Party because they are kind of like every movie about the immigrant household is like the strict dad being like, no, no, no. Yeah. So anyways, I think that that's well observed, and or I think that that's a great point that you bring up, and also something for everyone to kind of keep uh to sort of stay aware of.
That's what Rafferty was saying, though, is you got to go kind of beneath the surface and just like not. And this goes back to our conversation from, you can't just read the headlines.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
whatever, I will say Conclave is always one of the most fascinating things in the whole world to me. The secretive nature of it, the smoke that comes out, the fact that we really could have a historic pope, we could have the first American pope, there have been African popes before, but there's never really been like a black pope. We could have the first Asian pope. I think there's someone from the Philippines, maybe that is a leading contender. And of course, we could have another, our 97th Italian Pope. And that's very possible too. But it could very much be a historic thing, and no one knows. And yeah, we'll certainly be watching because even as I feel like religion has died out a little bit in the public sphere, that you and I have talked about it, we don't talk about it as much. We're certainly talking about it more now in a lot of ways. And whoever this next pope is going, there's still a billion, 1.1 billion Catholics in the world. It's the pope is still a really big deal. And I think yeah, the whole process will be fascinating. I certainly will be watching.
Yeah, I will be staying tuned as well. Well, I guess with that, I suppose we can leave it there. Till next time, buddy.
See ya.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though we did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.